Welcome everyone. This is Zelda's podcast and I'm Zelda. I record conversation with amazing people all around the world and across fields. I hope to inspire you with unconventional tales, ones of real people who have taken the leap to become heroes in their community. Today I am talking with Daria Halprin. Daria was born in 1948 to Lawrence, her father, a renowned landscape architect, and Anna, her mother, also known as the mother of postmodern dance. Daria was in her early 20s when the hippie movement started in the 70s in California, but she didn't wait this time to live a very unconventional life with her artist parents. Daria and her mother were pioneers in using dance as a healing art. Together, they co founded the Tamalpa Institute, a center in which you learn exactly that dancing in order to heal yourself, but also so much more, and in which I myself studied. Daria is a teacher, dancer, and performer. She is also a former actress. During the conversation, we mentioned that she studied under Fritz, the founder of the Gestalt therapy, a very well-known form of psychotherapy. Sitting with Daria on the dance deck built by her parents and on which she has danced ever since she was a child was a dream of mine. Her work has been foundational in my own personal journey, and I highly recommend you to check out the Tamalpa Institute. Enjoy this conversation. Daria, if
Yes.
we had to tell the story of your life, starting with once upon a time, where would that take us? How would that story start?
Well, uh, let's see, when if we're going to turn it into a once upon a time story, let me think about that for a minute. Never thought about it from a children's book point of view, so to speak. Um, well, my story started here in the woods, in the redwoods of Northern California, at the foot of Mount Tamalpais. Uh, my parents were two alternative artists and designers, Anna and Lawrence Halprin, and they were also both lovers of nature. And so my childhood was infused with this beautiful place that we lived and grew up in that is near San Francisco, but feels a little bit like it's awfully far away. So, as a child, I grew up in an atmosphere that was filled with imagination and fantasy, actually. And I danced on this beautiful dance deck, uh, beginning when I could barely walk. There's actually a photograph of me with my mother walking down those stairs right over there. She's holding my hand, and we have a little puppy dog, and I'm in my little leotard, and she's in her leotard, and we're walking down to this dance deck to dance together. My father was an environmental designer and a landscape architect, and he also was, in a sense, an artist throughout his life. He loved to draw and paint, and his drawing practice spanned from creating remarkable designs for urban landscapes and beautiful home environments for people who were building mid-century homes here in California, kind of for the first time. This was in the early 1950s. And so he would take me hiking every Sunday to a nearby lake, and we would study the plant life, and he would expect me to memorize all the different plants along the way, and we would pick some and we'd bring them home, and we would press them between in this special flower press that I think probably my mother had found for these hikes with my father every weekend. And And so between hiking with my father and collecting flowers and learning about nature and dancing with my mother and running away from home with my sister into this beautiful redwood forest where we would play amongst the trees, that was a kind of a very remarkable childhood that I began with. And that's not to say that that childhood wasn't filled with its own kind of difficulties, but it was very unique in that way, very, very alternative. And so from childhood, in a way, I think that I was mentored into a kind of an educational way of looking at life that had a profound connection to creativity and to nature. And it was unique in that way.
I can
Now,
imagine that.
now, when I went down the hill to the school that where all of the neighborhood children went to school, that was a very different kind of reality. So there was a real big contrast between the education and the creative life that I had because of my parents, both at home and also traveling through Europe with both of my parents' work. My father took me on many of his working trips abroad because he designed abroad as well, and I was part of my mother's touring dance company where we performed abroad. So there was that life, and then there was the very traditional life of going to school. My parents did not put us in an alternative school system. They put us in the neighborhood school, and I actually went to a very formal private girls' school for high school. So there was this huge discrepancy and conflict, which was an interesting choice on my parents' part.
Did you feel like you belong at school with the other students? Were you able to
No.
build friendships with people of your age?
Well, a little bit, but I always felt like the other because I had this life that was so radically different from most of the other kids that were part of this community. So I always felt odd in that way. I mean, when I was in with the adult community that my parents were involved with, I felt very much like a part of that community. But with my own age group, I felt very disconnected and very odd. And that was actually problematic. Yeah. Yeah.
And how was the school experience regarding the classes? So when you weren't dancing or exploring nature, right? You were
Yeah.
studying. How was that? Was it difficult? Was it?
You know, in and of itself, it wasn't. You know, this was the 1950s. Very different kind of a world, even than the world that my own children and grandchildren belonged to. So, in and of itself, it wasn't. I mean, in some ways, there was something reassuring about having that in contrast to this wildlife, at home. That in some ways could be a little bit too much, being so adult in its orientation. It wasn't oriented towards a child's capacity to integrate stimulation. So in some ways, it was an important counterpoint, and in other ways, it was confounding. So that became the story of my life, really. You know, a confounding contrast of different worlds. And that's why I think I probably started getting interested in psychology, being aware of these confounding worlds trying to live together.
Yeah, interesting. This makes me think as a teenager, I think that we're really trying to find ourselves, right? To find our path and to explore what is it about our identity. And so I guess we're exploring contrast a lot at that age. but you have a very special experience with that, and finding a way to thread different worlds together as you also went into this path of gathering psychology with the expressive arts. But we'll get into that a little later. I wonder if little Daria had dreams apart from this beautiful environment that, as you said, was already
Yeah.
amazing. I can imagine for a child.
Well, what's interesting when I think back on my childhood is that it was not my dream to be a dancer and an artist, even though I was. That wasn't my dream. I imagined that I would be a teacher or a nurse. And I remember playing games with all of my childhood friends, and particularly with my sister, who was my most accessible companion, kind of being up here. This neighborhood didn't look then like it looks now. There weren't any neighbors nearby. This was 1950 and the early 60s. And so my sister was my closest playmate. And I had a few other friends from this dance co-op that my mother ran that I was part of. And there I felt quite at home with the other kids. And we had these dance classes every Saturday with some of the children from our local community whose parents wanted their children to learn a different kind of dance. So that was very nice. And with my sister and a couple of those friends, I remember a consistent desire to play school and teacher, and to be the teacher who would, take care of the way children learned, which is interesting to think about now. I had an early calling towards that, apparently.
Yeah.
But I also, in some ways even more so, wanted to be a nurse. I wanted to heal the wounded. So both of these things were early callings for me. Isn't that interesting?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder, I think that I've heard you talk about it before. Did you have a desire sometimes to actually have a conventional family?
Oh,
To
sure.
look like the others?
Oh, sure. Everybody wants to have a family that's kind of different than theirs, for all kinds of reasons. It is true that I longed for a sense of stability and more likeness with the world that I saw around me. And yeah, even in the 1960s, when the culture started to change, and there was this very alternative culture that started to really explode around us, I still, because of the particular community where my parents lived, I still was very aware of being other than everybody else. However, by the time I was a teenager, being alternative was beginning to be in vogue. And so I found my own way, different from my parents, really, of my own. That's when really I started finding my own alternative path. To some extent, my parents weren't very keen about it because their approach to non-conventional living was really contextualized within the art that they were producing. And in some ways, they had a somewhat conflicted relationship between what they were choosing to follow alternative ways with and what they wanted to hold in more traditional terms. Yeah. So that became a clash when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And in the 60s, there was a lot of experimentation with drugs and I'm not talking about the kind of drugs that started infiltrating the culture later on, but uh, you know, drugs, drugs like mushrooms and marijuana and mind-altering drugs that was before some of the problematic drugs that started hitting young people. Um, and the sexual revolution was
Right.
happening,
Mm.
and although they weren't really comfortable with all of that for their daughters.
Mm.
So that was an interesting point of conflict. But it was a time when I was seeking to define myself in my own terms.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that must have been difficult because I guess for a lot of people it's easy to get a bit marginal as a teenager and to create this contrast with their parents because their parents are on this pretty conventional path. So you just you don't have to go way far from the conventional path or away from your parents' path in order
Yeah, that's a
to
good point.
like
Yes.
define yourself.
Yeah.
And you were born in a very unconventional
Yeah.
path, so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
imagine that this must have been difficult to separate from your parents at that
Yeah,
time.
quite in many important ways, and I wouldn't wish that on young people today. Um, and here's why. Um, it's interesting. I'm 75 years old. The world isn't as safe as it used to be for young people in terms of finding things to rebel with, and that's too bad. Uh, but I would really hope for young people today that there would be ways to find alternative paths that are also, uh, you know, safe,
Mm.
safe, and not cautious. That's not what I mean by safe, but safe for the body's health, safe for the mind's health. Um, and I think that there are actually more alternatives for young people to differentiate themselves from their parents now
Mm.
than there were for us in the 1960s and late 50s. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it
I actually think
does.
that there are more alternatives, and
Mm.
that's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
Uh, Having said that, I'm very glad that I got the more conventional forms of education that I did. I'm very glad for that. In some ways, I wish I had gotten more, and I know that that's not really what your theme is. Um, I wish that I had, and I don't know what it's like in Europe, and particularly in France, but in the United States now, there are a lot of alternative educational paths that young people can take,
Mm. Right.
even through open universities and universities that allow young people to, kind of create their own field of study. And I wish I had had a little bit more of that kind of alternative education,
Mm.
if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, many thoughts here. Well, I I think that the world is going in the right direction. I'm very optimistic that indeed there is more and more alternatives, educational paths for young people. And the intention with the podcast is to talk about them and to talk about people who they're taking them because I think that it's still very difficult to um, make the leap and decide to go on a path when you haven't had any models, any people
Yeah,
talking about them before.
yeah, yeah.
I think we're still at the beginning, and I hope that this podcast help more people actually step on this alternative path. I
You know,
mhm.
when I think about my childhood, my parents were not only my parents, they were my mentors in terms of my educational process. I didn't have mentors at school. The educational system was not, wasn't based on this notion of mentorship. And so I had to differentiate between my parents as parents and my parents as educators.
Right.
And then, as I got older and moved into, especially late teens and early 20s, I was able to find some mentors. And those mentors were the people that were most important to me. Mm-hmm. That's where I learned the most, having those models of innovative thinkers and who I could learn from and fashion myself after in some ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's amazing. I also studied with many mentors, and I found that this really informed the way I learn in general. And I know that you spent a lot of time or some time studying with Fritz pearls.
Yes, sometime. I wish I had had more.
Yeah. Could you tell me more about this mentoring concept in as a way to educate yourself, and like how does it look like maybe, and the work that you've explored with Fritz pearls?
Well, it wasn't a specific mentorship. I wish it had been. He didn't he didn't he didn't form mentorship relationships with people, but what he would do is he would practice his work in group settings. And so if you were in one of his groups, one of his Gestalt therapy groups, as I was, you had the opportunity to watch him working. Yeah. And that was incredible to, in some ways it was like the classical apprenticeships where you watch the master working and you learned by just watching and watching and watching. And so as I went out as a young teacher and therapist myself, I would try to imitate Fritz, which was pretty funny because I was 25 years old. I was young like you are. I started very young moving into these kinds of roles. In some ways, I was far too young to be doing that. But there I did it. I dove in. I learned by making the mistakes that I made and by learning what I didn't know. And in some ways, I learned by imitating my mentors, people who I had watched working, who I was so inspired by, and kind of, okay, I'll do it like I saw them do it. And to some extent, that also includes a way that I mirrored my mother in her work. At the same time, I was really trying to find a different way, which is also was helpful to have a frame of reference that she provided, so that I could experiment with, okay, here's what I learned from her. Here's how I watched her work. Now I'm going to find my own way. So I had a point of reference that was very important to move off of and to come back to. And I think that that's an important way to understand mentorship as well. To mirror and to have a point of reference to move off of and come back to when you get lost and when you have questions. So with Fritz also, I was in a group of dancers and theater people that had formed around my mother called the Dancers Workshop Company. It was the first group that she was working with in the early 60s. And we worked with Fritz in these kind of laboratories where he would work with each person in the group therapeutically. And that was really incredible to watch him work with us in that way. Yeah. I would have loved to have had an even more direct mentorship, but he didn't. He wasn't doing that.
Yeah.
This is what he would do, and I would just kind of watch and watch and watch.
It's super interesting. So, what I'm hearing is with mentors, how to find this balance between imitating your mentor to learn, and also what do you want to take from their practice with you and kind of make it your own thing, your own practice. How do you differentiate from your mentor? That's really interesting, and I think that this is not something we do anymore. Apprenticeships, I
Yeah.
think this used to be a very common way to learn, that isn't that much the case anymore. Could you tell us more on, well, Fritz Perl's work and your own? Um, I think that this was the beginning of the Tamalpa
Yes.
Institute, right? So,
Well,
could you tell us about more about this whole movement, this whole new concept?
yeah, not exactly. Uh, it's not. It wasn't exactly the beginning of Tamalpa Institute. The beginning of Tamalpa Institute was the Dancers Workshop Company, and that was really Anna and the young, and the Dancers Workshop. The Dancers Workshop began with a group of multidisciplinary artists and working experimentally here and in San Francisco and also in Europe, also abroad, uh, uh, to discover a new way to make art, new way to make performance art. At the same time, Anna was a dance educator. That was always her calling. So she had these two domains that she was always exploring and experimenting in. The domain of creating a new form of dance and a new form of performance art. And that began for her in 1952, really actively, when she had this studio and this dance deck that my father built. She had been a dance educator as a young woman on the East Coast, and also a more conventional dance performer. And there's a whole story about Anna's early years, and their moving out to the West Coast and what that allowed for both of them. They were young; they were in their 20s,
Yeah,
and
right.
real brilliant innovators. But she was interested in a new form of performance art, a new form of dance, and it then had a name called postmodern dance. She's considered the mother of postmodern dance, actually. She never quite understood that title that she got, and I would always say, well, just relax and enjoy it because you are. And but it was a whole new movement that was really impacting all forms of art. All forms of art on the East Coast and on the West Coast. Painting, music. This is a whole conversation about the postmodern art movement, which she was part of. Theater, visual art, music. There was a whole movement that began to grow here in the San Francisco Bay Area called the Dilexi movement, which my parents were part of. It was very experimental, and it was grounded in this notion of artists from different fields working together and busting open conventional forms of art making and performance and design. It was impacting architecture. So that's really the beginnings of Tamalpa Institute, in fact.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very big field of knowledge that's really fascinating. And that is where my education comes from. That was before Fritz Perls. I was in theater during the late 50s and early 60s, this new theater that was happening. And I was being exposed, if you will, trained by my mother in this new approach to movement and dance that wasn't based on established forms of how movement and the body needed to look from the outside or fit into established dance forms. So she was looking at, and she studied with a woman named Margaret Dobler in her college years, who was a scientist and a movement educator and so Anna was coming from this orientation of how is the body designed to move, if you will, an attempt to find a natural way of movement that would be connected to feelings, to imagination, and to the life of the mover. And so that started very early on, and then to take it into her performance work, which was a slightly different kind of a look. Yeah, now Tamalpa Institute came to be in the 70s. And so I should go back and say that already the Dancers Workshop and the Dancers Workshop Company was a very alternative way of creating art, but also educating people, because people started to come to study. People who were already interested in the arts, dancers, theater people, musicians. So they started to come to study this new approach. So the Dancers Workshop was already an alternative education for people to come and study and also create art together. Now, by the mid-70s, and I started teaching in 1975, I think. And, there's a whole story about how that happened and why. But I was in a crisis point, and I had a little baby, and I had to make my way, and this is what I knew how to do. I didn't have any money. I was, it was a breakdown inflection point in my life, and so I returned to my roots. And I thought, okay, well, this is what I know. This is what I've been trained in, so I guess I won't go to nursing school. I guess I'll do this.
Yeah.
To go back to my childhood, where I imagined that I would be a nurse and save the wounded. So I thought, okay, well, I'll be a teacher, which was the other childhood fantasy. And I came back to teaching what I knew and what I had been trained in through this very alternative upbringing and education. And also I must have had a passion for it and a gift. Otherwise, I would have done something else. And I think that as young people search for alternative ways to learn, that's really important. Pay attention to the gifts and the passion that you have, and where can you find mentorship and learning that will help you build on that, not just do what you know or even do what you feel, but build on it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, really, really find ways to expand it, to develop it, to learn more about the possibilities. And so my way of doing that, because this is what I had available at the time, is that I started teaching, and the studio and the students became my mentors. I don't know that I would recommend that for anybody else, but it's what I had available.
This was your way.
That was my way. It was a hard way. It was a hard way. And I think it was because of my upbringing and all the training that I had received from such an early age that I was able to stand in the fire of doing it that way, kind of alone, if you will, and being in the fire of that kind of, um, of a relationship with people who were studying and being so young and occupying the teacher's role and having to find my sense of knowing and knowledge and ground, but also my desire to find, to be experimental, uh, and to be able to do it in a way that was effective and responsible without having formal education and a formal mentorship either.
Right.
So, I mean, I was quite lucky. I it was very challenging, and I made a lot of remarkable discoveries through this avenue that I chose, and these incredible people who were coming from all over the world to the Halprin studio, who I was so blessed to be able to work with as a teacher and really learn from them. Well, how are they responding to this work that I'm offering? What happens? What happens? So, just as I watched Fritz work with people, I watched these remarkable people, these remarkable students work with these offerings that I made, and I was witness to what could happen as I made these discoveries and experiments around how to bring therapy and dance and visual art and poetry together in one new kind of approach and school.
Yeah, because you are an innovator and
Along with many other people who were
yeah.
who were innovating with me and were part of the whole field that was happening. But yes, I was innovating some very new kinds of experiences.
I can imagine the importance of the community, as you mentioned many times. I think that's the beauty of internet in a way, because I know a lot of people find their people, find their tribe online when they are not able to make it to San
Mm.
Francisco, which is still to this day a place where lots of people are traveling to in order to find other people seeking to create innovations and to think of problems to solve. Um,
That's interesting. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine being able to try what I tried and accomplish what I accomplished, to be honest, and um, be in direct relationship with people who are uh, who were at that time uh, really really immersing themselves in new transformational practices. I cannot imagine how I could have done any of it or learned what I did through the internet, to be absolutely honest. I'm glad that I was a child of the 60s and that I was a young teacher in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I have to be honest about it. I think it's important for people to be together in person. Now, I say that having put Tamalpa trainings online and, having to learn how to transmit something entirely online with Tamalpa students who say that they're having transformational experiences with what we're doing, even though they're not in the studio together and they're not in the studio directly with me or the other teachers. So I just don't know that I would have, that I could learn now what I was able to learn then. Does that make sense to you? As a
Absolutely.
teacher, I
Yeah.
don't know, because I learned so much as a teacher.
Mm. I think that we're in the very first days of the internet, and that we're, especially since COVID happened, we had to learn
Yeah,
how to build
yeah,
communities and
yeah.
how to make learning happen online in a way that will always look differently than in real life, but that could still create some magic. And I think that this is for sure the favorite tool of many teenagers to find
Yes, for sure. For
their
the teenagers, for sure, yeah.
yeah, their teachings, their mentors, their people.
Yeah,
But I absolutely agree that it is limited. It allows a lot of things, and it's also very limited. And ultimately, I think that when you choose an alternative educational path, you have to find a way to study in the real world, if I can put it this way. Um, I want to go back to your teen years and to a chapter of your life when you've been an actress. I as I discovered that, I imagined that, and I might be wrong. This could have been a way to look for your path. This experience as an actor. Um, could you tell us
well,
more about that?
it, you know, I didn't look for it. It found me.
Mm.
That wasn't my dream. Uh, it found me because of my life as a dancer in the San Francisco Bay Area scene. So I'd been in some documentaries. I was I was 18 years old. 19 I was yeah, I was 17, 18 years old. I was in college. I was studying at UC Berkeley, and I wanted to go to college. I hadn't quite figured out what I wanted to do because, as I said, I, I, it wasn't my intention uh, to make my life's work dance or theater even. Uh, so I was studying at UC Berkeley, uh, and the filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni saw some documentary films that had been done that I was in as an avant-garde dancer in the San Francisco Bay Area, with the Dancers Workshop and also with the San Francisco Committee that I had done some things with in those early days. And so he saw this documentary, and something about the way I looked and the way I moved led him to believe that I might be the person for this part in this movie, Zabriskie Point, he was making. So he tracked me down, and I got a call when I was in the I was actually studying. I was taking some courses in visual art, uh, just for fun, uh, with a guy named Ron Nagel, who I knew from our experimental art community. He became a very well-known ceramicist, and he was teaching. There were some really great teachers at UC Berkeley during those years, and so I got a phone call when I was in uh, in the art studio department, and it was from Michelangelo Antonioni, who had somehow tracked me down. It was really wild when you think of it, how he tracked me down. So, and we were all very keen on Bergman and Antonioni films at that time in Berkeley in the 1960s. Fairling, Fellini, Bergman, and Antonioni were the filmmakers we were all watching in those years. So I thought, oh wow, this is interesting. I'll go meet him.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened.
Wow.
And I, so I really didn't know what I was doing as a speaking actress, because my whole background and experience had been in nonverbal theater. And so I was a fish out of water, really. And so after the film was over, I thought, well, I'll go study acting because I didn't feel very well equipped. Didn't, I felt like if I was going to continue pursuing that I ought to have more training in it. So I started taking classes at the Lee Strasberg School in Los Angeles. And actually, I found a mentor named Peggy Fury, who was a very famous Strasberg teacher. We became friends, and I started a little mentorship with her. And I went on a few auditions for films, and I lived in Hollywood, during that time. And I didn't like it. I didn't like the atmosphere. I didn't like the culture. And uh, I hadn't made a decision to leave yet, but I wasn't comfortable there. It was so different than the environment that I was used to growing, here in the Bay Area. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I would say I was pretty lost at that time. And then I went to a film festival. I had been tagged as the up and coming young actress of the times because of the film. You know, it really had nothing to do with me
Yeah.
or my acting job in Zabriskie Point. But that's Hollywood for you. It was. Um, but I was tagged as the new promising. I think it had a lot to do with the way I looked. I was quite beautiful when I was a young woman. I didn't think so. I didn't pay any attention to that at the time, but when I look at photographs of myself now, I went, "Oh yeah, they were right. I was quite beautiful then." um, and so it was really about how I looked, and I was the new young woman on the block in Hollywood, and so to I went to Zagreb. There was a big film festival in Zagreb, and Easy Rider was receiving an award, and I was receiving some kind of recognition. And I met Dennis Hopper at that film festival. He was there for Easy Rider, which received an award, and I was there having received this title and with Zabriskie Point. I met Dennis Hopper, and that became a whole other story. And so that's what precipitated my leaving, actually, the whole film thing in Hollywood and whatnot. And by the time I was finished with that relationship and had a baby, it was time to come home and find my way back to my roots and to a very intensive healing process. Yeah. And not that I would. I mean, the experience with Antonioni was really awesome. I mean, he was an iconic filmmaker, and it was really, really quite an experience. And in a way, ultimately, it sent me back to my roots.
Yeah, that's what I imagined. What I imagined is that in a way this chapter as an actress and then with this love story, we could maybe frame it as losing yourself, trying to find or being on another path, right? Until finally getting back in the bay, to the work that you've been doing for your whole life, and yeah, I wonder how then. So as you said earlier, you started teaching. Um, at what point, or what? I guess it was also diffused, but how did the therapeutic aspects came into the dancers workshop that became Tamalpa?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So, first of all, I uh, I was introduced to Fritz and his work in the 1960s before I went off to Hollywood. And Anna was very close to Fritz, and uh, and loved Gestalt therapy, and felt that it it would felt the resonance between Gestalt therapy and the kind of physical theater that she was experimenting with at the time, and the kind of narrative material she was bringing into her work as a dancer on stage. So both of us, in different ways, had these connections with Gestalt therapy. She resonated with it in one way, and I resonated with it in a slightly different way. So when I came back from my Hollywood and experience, and my marriage to Dennis Hopper, which was quite traumatic, and that experience of really having lost my ground almost entirely, and not knowing what to do next, and having a little baby, which was terrifying. I realized that I needed therapy, and so I started that healing process for myself. And I started working in therapy with a man named Robert Hall, who had been a senior student of Fritz Perls, and who developed an approach that integrated Gestalt therapy with somatics and body work. Not movement, but somatics and body work. And so I worked with Robert for a number of years. We became close friends, and he became my mentor. And I worked with him very closely every week for a number of years, sometimes several times a week. I joined a therapy group of other young students who were practicing to become therapists, and we would do therapy together, and he would supervise us and mentor us. I worked with him privately, and so that's when I began to be called to bringing these two worlds together, the world of therapy and movement. And then I began experimenting with that in Dancer's Workshop. As a teacher, I started seeing clients privately, and I experimented with my clients. I started introducing drawings, and I did a lot of Gestalt therapy work. So it was really Gestalt therapy and movement work with some of the drawings as a way for people to kind of surface their dreams and their symbolic imagery. And so that's how it started. And then I heard about this department at a college in Boston called Lesley College, and I heard that there was a department. This was much later. This was this was about 5 years into my doing this work through Dancer's Workshop. I heard that there was this field called expressive arts therapy that was beginning to become formed, and that people felt that what I was doing was part of this new field called expressive arts therapy. And I thought, oh, well, that's an interesting thing to call it. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. We'll call it expressive arts therapy. It was just the very, very beginning. And the person who came up with this term was a man who also became my mentor, named Paolo Canil, who started a graduate school called the European Graduate School. Now, if you want to talk about alternative education, being able to be in a structured environment of learning and mentorship, and not trying to do it all by yourself, Tamalpa Institute and the European Graduate School are two fantastic examples of exactly that combination of being able to be really properly trained uh, and, and have very close mentorship outside of the conventional formalized colleges and universities. So at any rate, now by the by about 1976, 77, I approached Anna with a challenge. I said, this really isn't the Dancers Workshop what we're doing anymore. We're a school and we're educating people in this new form of movement and somatics and therapy. And yes, we're working with performance and we're working with dance, but we're doing something more than that. And we need to redefine ourselves. And we jostled back and forth about it. And she finally agreed to kind of create a new title for the school. She came up with a name after the mountain, and I said it's time for us to commit to some systems and some principles and a curriculum, so that we give people a sense of an anatomy of practice, and that we keep alive our experimentation and our alternative approaches, but that we create a structure that that will make sense also to the outside world, so that people who come to study with us can go back out into their own lives as teachers and therapists and have a body of work to offer. So that's how that came to be. And I'd already started really defining some of the systems that are now kind of the foundational methodology of the Tamalpa Life Art practice. Yeah.
It is amazing to me that you were able to make those two worlds meet, the world of art and the world of therapy and psychology. I find it very special also because I think that lots of young people, lots of people, and in particular, I'm thinking of teenagers, might have many passions, many interests, and oftentimes when they have to decide what to do after high school, they need to give up on some things, and that's been a challenge of mine, how to figure out bridges between my interests. And I think that many times those bridges are what creates innovation. You're creating a field by trusting that those two worlds can live together. And I also love that the Tamalpa Institute was born in such an experimental way.
Yes, it was.
And I think that it's also part of the what makes it still to this day very alternative. I am a student of the Tamalpa Institute, and I wouldn't have been able to study after high school, as I'm a high school dropout. So Tamalpa Institute is the only formal education I received since high school. And although I use the word formal, this was really alternative, and this is why I was very keen to study in the institute. I wonder, to close up this conversation, what would you say to young people that are listening to us who might feel lost with their path, who are maybe in high school or in their early 20s, and that just don't know? They might have dreams, they might have interests, but it's just so hard. Probably it's harder, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, to go after your dreams in today's world.
I think it is.
what kind of message would you like them to hear from your own perspective?
Well, as we've been talking, I've been reminded of the importance of the mentors in my life. And looking back, I'm so touched by how important that was, uh, and to the extent that oh, I wish I would have had even more time with that mentor, more time with that mentor, uh, and I would say that that's find a mentor. I think that the most valuable education we receive comes through the kind of teachers we have in our lives. Find the teacher who's right for you. Find the teacher who is right for you. Don't I personally I wouldn't advise doing it all on your own. I think one, it's lonely, and two, there is so much knowledge out there. And elders have so much to give, have so much knowledge and life experience to give. And while I think it's wonderful to kind of innovate your own way as a young person, as I did, I think having an advisor or two or three is really, really important. And I never would have been able to innovate on my own if I hadn't had those mentors. Yeah. And the remarkable life context that I had of this incredible Tamalpa Institute studio, which also was my mentor. Yeah. So that's what I would say. Find mentors. Find elders.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your wonderful conversation, your wonderful mind, and the adventure you're taking. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast. I really enjoy this support. Many more awesome episodes are coming. And until then, you can follow me at Zelda Poem on any social media to learn more about how to navigate life as a young hacker, creative artist.